He looked like a storybook knight, brought to life, long golden hair flowing down to his shoulders, a boyish grin that seemed more suited to a theater stage than a battlefield. His enemies called him reckless, his admirers called him fearless, and newspapers across the Union called him something even more intoxicating, a hero. George Armstrong Custer was just 23 when he became a general, 23. An age when most of his soldiers hadn't even grown whiskers. In the middle of the Civil War, when bodies were stacked like cordwood and commanders were aging, grizzled veterans, Custer was promoted in a blaze of sudden glory. He was fast, he was loud, and most importantly, he was flashy. He rode into battle in a custom-made uniform, dripping with gold braid. He carried not one but two dogs into camp, and once even sported a bright red scarf that made him stand out like a target. A target he wanted everyone to see, because for Custer, war wasn't just survival, it was theater. And in the blood-soaked theater of the Civil War, Custer's appetite for reckless charges paid off. Time and again, he hurled his cavalry forward at full tilt, sometimes against impossible odds. His soldiers suffered, yes, but newspapers loved it. They wrote glowing reports of Custer's daring dash, Custer's miraculous bravery, Custer's boy general genius. The fact that many of his victories were really suicidal gambles that just happened to work. That part didn't make the headlines. He was the TikTok sensation of his time. Every reckless stunt went viral on paper. Each bold gamble turned into a headline, each flashy gesture immortalized as legend. And the truth was far messier. Officers grumbled that he was dangerously impulsive, a gambler who treated soldiers' lives like poker chips. He had nearly been court-martialed for abandoning his posts to visit his wife. He was famous for disobeying orders when it suited him. To his critics, Custer wasn't a genius. He was a disaster waiting to happen. But disaster can be disguised as glory when the timing is right. And in the final years of the Civil War, when the Union desperately needed heroes, Custer's recklessness looked like courage. The newspapers crowned him a darling of the Republic. And the people, they ate it up. This was a young man who could turn slaughter into spectacle, who could reframe near-suicidal charges into myths of destiny. The truth was that he didn't just crave battle, he craved attention. Every victory added to his legend. Every scar made him more photogenic. Every risky maneuver carved deeper into the myth of the boy general. And myths, once created, take on a life of their own. When peace finally came, the Union Army was disbanding. Heroes were being packed away like old uniforms. But for Custer, the stage couldn't just go dark. Imagine a modern influencer whose fame depends on constant drama suddenly stripped of their platform. Without war, without battle, Custer was just another vain, impulsive man with a shiny jacket and an ego too large to fit in peacetime. And so he began searching for a new war, a new stage, a new way to stay in the headlines. Because for Custer, obscurity was the real death sentence. And he would find it. But not in Europe, not in politics, not even in the safety of retirement. He would find his next spotlight in the West. In a brutal war, not of liberation, but of conquest. And the boy general would ride once again straight into the kind of battle where no amount of golden hair, no matter how dazzling, could save him. Because when peace came, Custer needed a new war to stay famous. It was all written down. Promises signed in ink, sealed with ceremony, paraded as proof of America's honor. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 guaranteed the Lakota and their allies something unthinkable in the age of westward expansion. The Black Hills, sacred land, set apart for their absolute and undisturbed use. In theory, the treaty was permanent. In practice, it lasted less than a decade. Because gold has a way of erasing promises. When prospectors stumbled into the Black Hills in the 1870s, they reported something that electrified the nation: glittering seams of gold, ripe for the taking. The federal government knew the treaty forbade this intrusion. But instead of stopping the rush, they looked the other way. Miners flooded in by the thousands, tearing through sacred sites like frenzied looters at an apocalypse sale. The Lakota watched in fury. This wasn't just a land grab, it was a desecration. The Black Hills weren't just hills, they were the center of the world, the axis of creation, the beating heart of their culture. To violate them was to rip apart the very fabric of life. Imagine if someone bulldozed through Mecca or Vatican City to set up a gold mine. That's the level of outrage. But Washington didn't care. Politicians began framing the treaty not as binding law, but as a nuisance. In 1875, officials summoned Lakota leaders to negotiate a purchase of the Black Hills. The chiefs refused. They weren't bargaining chips, they were caretakers. And if the United States wanted those hills, they would have to take them by force. The government's response: they issued an ultimatum. All hostile Indians must report to reservations by January 31, 1876, or be treated as enemies. It was a setup designed for failure. Winter on the plains was lethal. Moving entire nations with families, horses, and supplies across snow-choked wilderness was impossible. Washington knew this. The deadline wasn't a demand, it was a trap. And when thousands did not comply, the U.S. declared war. But this war was different. The tribes were not fractured and scattered, as they often had been. They were united. Sitting Bull, a spiritual leader, urged defiance, rallying his people with visions of resistance. Crazy Horse, a brilliant tactician, prepared the warriors for battle. They gathered in massive encampments that grew into sprawling cities of teepees, living proof that native power was not dead, but rising. The scale of the resistance was shocking. Imagine the largest protest you've ever seen, but armed, mounted, and infused with the desperate energy of people defending their very survival. Thousands of warriors from the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho banded together. For the first time in generations, they weren't outnumbered. The U.S. military was not prepared for what came next. Commanders assumed the tribes would scatter at the first sign of soldiers. That had been the script for decades. The army marches, the natives flee, another box ticked on the road to expansion. But this time, the tribes did not scatter, they consolidated. They grew stronger. They refused to play the role of vanishing Indians in America's manifest destiny. And this is where Custer re-enters the story. He wasn't marching into some ragtag group of savages. He was marching into the teeth of the largest native force ever assembled on the plains. A force not only defending its homes, but enraged by betrayal, emboldened by unity, and fueled by the bitter knowledge that the U.S. government's honor meant nothing when gold was at stake. The war was never supposed to be fair. The government expected a quick, clean victory, a tidy removal of hostiles to make way for mining and settlement. But in 1876, the script broke. The tribes didn't just resist, they began to win. And that made Custer's campaign something far more dangerous than a military expedition. Because Custer wasn't just fighting warriors, he was fighting his own government's lies. The summer sun burned over the Montana plains in June 1876, and Custer was already spoiling for glory. He wasn't just marching to fight, he was marching to etch his name into history. His orders were clear: join forces with other army columns, find the so-called hostile encampments, and crush them. But Custer had never been a man for patience or cooperation. Where others saw a complex campaign, he saw a stage and he wanted the starring role. Reports reached him of a massive native village ahead. Scouts warned him. Thousands of warriors, perhaps more than he had ever faced. He should have hesitated. He should have waited for reinforcements. Instead, he smiled. To Custer, the bigger the risk, the bigger the headline. But his soldiers weren't smiling. They were exhausted. The march had been brutal: scorching days, freezing nights, dwindling rations. Horses stumbled, tongues lolling from thirst. Ammunition wagons trailed far behind, too slow to keep pace. The Seventh Cavalry was lean, underfed, and strung out across the landscape. And yet Custer chose this moment, this fragile, desperate moment, to gamble everything. He divided his force into three. Imagine being outnumbered in a hostile wilderness, then deciding to split your army into pieces. It was the kind of decision that defies logic. But Custer believed speed and audacity could replace numbers. He believed the village would panic and scatter, as others had before. He believed the myth he had built around himself, that his presence alone turned chaos into triumph. But the encampment he was about to face wasn't just another target. This was the largest gathering of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho ever seen on the plains. It stretched for miles along the Little Bighorn River, women, children, elders, warriors, an entire nation on the move. Smoke from cooking fires curled into the sky like signals of defiance. For every soldier under Custer's command, there were at least 4 native warriors waiting. The scouts tried to warn him. One, Mitch Bowyer, reportedly turned pale when he saw the sheer size of the village from a distant ridge. "We are going to our deaths," he muttered. But Custer dismissed the fear. He accused the scouts of exaggeration, of cowardice. He had built his career on reckless charges. Why should this be different? And yet, there were cracks. Some of his officers knew the risk. Marcus Reno, leading one of the divided battalions, felt unease clawing at his stomach. The men whispered about the size of the enemy camp, about the lack of supplies, about the sheer madness of the plan. They had seen Custer gamble before, but never with stakes this high. By June 25th, the trap was set. The 7th Cavalry crested the ridges above the Little Bighorn, expecting to surprise a scattering village. Instead, they looked down upon a vast sprawl of teepees, horses grazing, children playing, warriors armed and ready. It was less a village, more a city, alive with thousands who had no intention of fleeing. This wasn't the script Custer expected. There would be no easy victory, no sudden rout to turn into a headline. There would only be fire, fury, and the full weight of a people who had been betrayed one too many times. Still, Custer pressed on. He urged his men forward, down the ridges, into the river valley, into the heart of the storm. Soldiers tightened reins, muskets clutched in sweaty hands. Some muttered prayers. Others stared in grim silence. They weren't marching into battle. They were marching into history's jaws. And as the first shots cracked across the valley, the myth of Custer's invincibility began to unravel. But the unraveling was only the beginning, because the truth about what happened next would shatter the very legend Custer had built. The story most people grew up with goes like this. Custer, surrounded by overwhelming numbers, stands tall on a ridge. His men form a desperate ring, rifles blazing in all directions, fighting heroically until the very last bullet. A Hollywood death, a noble sacrifice. But that version was never real. It was a cover story, a bedtime tale to soothe a nation humiliated by defeat. The truth of Custer's last stand was not a ring of heroes, it was chaos. When Marcus Reno charged into the southern end of the village, it didn't go the way Custer expected. Instead of scattering, warriors swarmed him. Gunfire exploded, horses screamed, soldiers fell in bloody heaps. Reno panicked. He ordered a retreat across the river, abandoning the dead and wounded. Dozens were cut down midstream, arrows and bullets turning the crossing into a slaughterhouse. Survivors clawed their way up the bluffs, trembling, traumatized, already broken. Meanwhile, Custer advanced on the northern end, unaware or unwilling to believe that Reno's attack had failed. He thought he was striking a village in disarray. Instead, he rode into a hornet's nest. Thousands of warriors wheeled toward him, mounted, armed, furious. Dust clouds rose like thunderheads as wave after wave closed in. Custer tried to deploy his men in skirmish lines across the ridges, but the scale was hopeless. He had maybe 210 soldiers. The warriors? Estimates range from 1,500 to 2,500. The Seventh Cavalry wasn't facing a village, it was facing a nation at war. And the battle didn't unfold like some neat choreographed duel. It was messy, terrifying, fast. Soldiers broke formation. Some fired wildly, others dropped their weapons and ran. Horses bolted in panic, trampling the wounded. The gunfire was relentless, but ammunition was limited. Carbines overheated. The dream of holding ground evaporated in minutes. Eyewitness accounts from native warriors later described the scene not as a glorious stand, but as a collapse. Soldiers staggered across the hills in small knots, cut off from each other, cut down one by one. Some fell on their knees, hands raised, pleading for mercy. Others shot themselves rather than be taken alive. The air reeked of black powder and blood, a choking haze of death. Custer himself was no cinematic commander that day. He wasn't rallying men with grand speeches. He wasn't waving a sword, bathed in golden light. In reality, he was just another desperate officer, shouting orders drowned by the roar of gunfire. He may have tried to regroup on a slope now called Last Stand Hill, but the ground offered no miracle. Warriors encircled the ridge from every side. Bullets whistled, arrows rained, the thin blue line shattered.
Here's the irony. Custer's so-called last stand wasn't even a stand. It was a rout. His men went shoulder to shoulder, fighting to the last breath. They were scattered corpses, sprawled across the ridges and ravines of the Little Bighorn. Evidence shows that some fell hundreds of yards from the hill, cut down as they fled. There was no final ring of glory, just panic.
Within less than an hour, it was over. 200 soldiers lay dead. Horses littered the battlefield. Silence rolled back across the hills, broken only by the cries of women mourning their families and the chants of warriors celebrating survival. The reality of Custer's defeat was humiliating not just for him, but for the United States Army. How could a few hundred men be annihilated so completely? The answer was simple: arrogance, underestimation and betrayal of treaties that had united the tribes against them. But those weren't explanations the government wanted the public to hear. So the myth was born. Newspapers romanticized the story, inventing scenes of heroic last resistance. Painful truths, panic, retreat, cowardice were erased. Custer was recast as a martyr, his defeat reframed as noble sacrifice rather than catastrophic blunder. The boy general who once gambled for headlines had now achieved immortality not through victory but through death. But for the soldiers left behind on that field, there was nothing noble about it. Their bodies told a very different story. A story so grotesque, so horrifying, that the United States would spend decades trying to bury it. Because the real horror wasn't how they died. It was what happened after. When relief forces finally reached the battlefield 2 days later, the summer air was thick with rot. Bodies sprawled across the hills in grotesque positions, swollen, blackened by the sun. Horses lay in piles, bloated, their legs stiff like broken sticks. But it wasn't just the carnage of battle that made hardened soldiers stagger and retch. It was what had been done to the bodies afterward. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaha hadn't simply killed their enemies, they had sent a message. The mutilations were not random acts of cruelty, they were symbols, warnings etched into flesh. Soldiers were stripped naked, their uniforms scattered, their bodies carved and pierced. Eyes were gouged out, noses cut away, mouths slashed open into rictus grins. Some had their hearts torn from their chests. Others had their genitals hacked off and stuffed into their mouths. The brutality was so extreme that even veterans of Civil War slaughter admitted they had never seen anything like it. And then there was Custer. The Golden Boy general, once the darling of the Union, now lay in the dirt, barely recognizable. Unlike many of his men, his body was not scalped, his face remained intact. But the details were chilling. His chest was riddled with bullet wounds, his ears had been pierced with sewing awls. It wasn't random mutilation, it was symbolic. Among Plains tribes, piercing a man's ears this way was a punishment, a spiritual rebuke. The message was clear: you did not listen. The mutilations horrified the army. Officers who buried the dead tried to hide the worst details from the press. They knew the truth would ignite outrage, but also humiliation. The nation might ask why this battle happened at all, why these men had been left to die under the command of a reckless officer chasing glory. So instead, the mutilations were recast as proof of savagery. But from the native perspective, these acts were not senseless brutality, they were ritual justice. Warriors believed mutilating the enemy's body could cripple his spirit in the afterlife, denying him peace. It was a way to balance cosmic scales after years of broken treaties and massacres committed by the very army now lying in pieces at Little Bighorn. Remember, the US military had burned villages, slaughtered women and children, hacked bodies in their own campaigns. The mutilations were, in many ways, a mirror. Still, the images lingered in the American mind, twisted into propaganda. Newspapers described them in lurid detail, stoking hatred, painting the tribes as monstrous fiends. The nuance was erased. Gone was the context of betrayal, of treaties violated, of sacred land invaded. What survived in the headlines was the grotesque spectacle: soldiers desecrated, the boy general cut down, civilization defiled by barbarism. But on the ground, the truth was undeniable. The Seventh Cavalry had not only been destroyed, they had been humiliated. And humiliation was something the United States would not tolerate. The mutilated bodies at Little Bighorn were not just a defeat, they were a wound to the nation's pride, one that demanded vengeance. Imagine the impact on the families back home. Widows received word not only that their husbands had died, but that their corpses had been desecrated. The horror was personal, intimate, designed to sting across generations. For Custer's wife, Libbie, the loss was doubled. Not only had she lost her husband, she lost control of his image. Unless, of course, she could rewrite the narrative. And she would. She would spend decades reshaping Custer from reckless egotist into tragic hero. But that story could only take root if the mutilations were framed as the actions of savages, not as messages of defiance from people pushed to the brink. The battlefield was cleaned up as best it could be. Bodies hastily buried in shallow graves, horses dragged into heaps. But the earth never forgot. Travelers for years afterward claimed they still found bones bleaching in the sun, relics of a day when arrogance met its reckoning. The mutilations shocked America. They enraged it. But more than that, they gave Washington exactly what it needed, a justification to escalate the war beyond anything the tribes had ever seen. Because Little Bighorn wasn't the end of the story. It was the excuse for the revenge campaign that followed. The bodies were still warm when the spin machine began. News of the disaster reached the telegraph wires, and within days, headlines screamed of tragedy, betrayal, and heroic sacrifice. Custer's name blazed across every front page in America, but the story being told was not the story of reckless arrogance and tactical failure. It was the story of a fallen martyr. The government had no interest in admitting the truth that Custer had split his forces, underestimated the enemy, and led his men into annihilation. That would mean admitting responsibility, not just for a battle, but for years of broken treaties and policies that had provoked it. Instead, the Little Bighorn was painted as a morality play, noble soldiers butchered by bloodthirsty savages. Newspapers went wild with grotesque exaggerations. Reports claimed soldiers were skinned alive, burned, tortured in unspeakable ways. The mutilations became propaganda, proof of Indian barbarity, conveniently omitting the fact that US troops had committed atrocities just as savage in previous campaigns. At Sand Creek, for example, soldiers had massacred women and children, mutilating corpses, parading severed body parts as trophies. But those details rarely made the front page. At Little Bighorn, the narrative was reversed. The soldiers were pure, the natives monstrous. And in the center of it all was Custer. His image was polished until it gleamed. The newspapers described him as gallant, a warrior cut down in his prime, a second Leonidas at Thermopylae. They conveniently ignored the fact that many of his men had panicked, fled, or surrendered. They erased the chaos, the rote, the ignoble reality. In its place they built a myth. Custer as the tragic hero, his defeat, a noble sacrifice on the altar of progress. It wasn't just the press driving the legend. Custer's widow, Libbie, became his most powerful publicist. She understood that her future depended on his reputation. A widow could vanish into obscurity, or she could transform herself into the guardian of a martyr. Libbie chose the latter. She toured the nation writing memoirs, giving speeches, curating her husband's memory like a sacred relic. In her version, George wasn't reckless. He was brave. He wasn't arrogant. He was loyal. He wasn't a fool. He was a saint. And the public ate it up. The United States needed a hero in 1876. It was the centennial year, 100 years since independence, a time when the nation craved stories of destiny and sacrifice. Custer's death was perfectly timed for myth-making. He wasn't a cautionary tale of hubris. He was recast as the embodiment of American courage, standing tall against impossible odds. The irony was staggering. A man who died because he ignored warnings, who abandoned prudence in pursuit of glory, became the face of military honor. The truth, that his defeat was the result of arrogance and lies, was buried under a mountain of patriotic spin. But for the Lakota, Cheyenne and Arapaho, the victory was not treated as triumph. It was cast as savagery, as an affront that demanded vengeance. They had defended their homes, their families, their sacred lands. They had fought brilliantly, uniting against overwhelming odds. Yet in the American imagination, they became villains, demons in a morality tale written by the very government that had broken its promises. The myth of the last stand didn't just distort the past, it weaponized it. It gave Washington political cover to escalate the war into a campaign of annihilation. Soldiers marched with a renewed sense of righteousness, believing they were avenging fallen heroes rather than enforcing broken treaties. Every mutilated corpse at Little Bighorn became justification for burning villages, slaughtering buffalo, and starving tribes into submission. The lesson was clear. If reality doesn't suit the nation's pride, reality will be rewritten. The battlefield where Custer's ego collapsed was turned into a shrine of American martyrdom, and the people who had fought to preserve their way of life were turned into monsters in the national story. But even myths have consequences. Because if Custer's death was immortalized as noble tragedy, then what came next? The retaliation, the revenge, the scorched earth destruction of native life was framed not as cruelty, but as justice. And justice, in this case, would mean genocide. The United States could not afford humiliation. The summer of 1876 was supposed to be a season of national pride, the centennial of independence, 100 years of freedom and triumph. And yet, as fireworks lit the skies above Philadelphia, the headlines carried a darker spectacle. An entire regiment annihilated on the plains, its golden-haired general lying dead in the dust. It was intolerable. Something had to be done. And so Washington called for vengeance. Not justice, not peace, vengeance. The orders were clear. The tribes must be broken. No more treaties, no more negotiations. This was not a war for victory. It was a war for erasure. Generals William Sherman and Philip Sheridan, both Civil War veterans hardened by total war, turned the full machinery of the U.S. Army against the plains. The Little Bighorn had shown what native unity could accomplish. The solution, in the minds of Sherman and Sheridan, was simple. Unity must be made impossible. Columns of troops spread across the frontier, torching villages, slaughtering horses, capturing women and children. Food supplies were burned, lodges destroyed, winter stores dumped into rivers. It was less a military campaign than a calculated starvation program. If the warriors would not submit, their families would suffer until they had no choice. But the cruelty didn't stop there. The buffalo herds, the lifeblood of the plains tribes, became targets too. Hunters, often encouraged by the government, killed them by the tens of thousands, sometimes leaving the carcasses to rot where they fell. Imagine an enemy destroying every grocery store, every farm, every refrigerator in a modern nation. That was what it meant to slaughter the buffalo. Without them, native life could not survive. The irony was chilling. At Little Bighorn, native warriors had fought to protect their homes, their lands, their families. They had won, and yet their victory triggered the very destruction they had feared all along. The United States would not tolerate defiance, not even once. The more brilliant the native resistance, the more ruthless the retribution. For Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, the months after Little Bighorn were a nightmare. Their great encampments, once full of confidence, were now harried, hunted, driven across frozen landscapes. Winter brought hunger, children starved, elders froze to death. The proud victory on the Little Bighorn became a bitter memory, overshadowed by the suffering that followed. And still the myth of Custer fueled the campaign. Soldiers marched believing they were avenging a martyred hero. Politicians in Washington painted every burned lodge and every dead buffalo as righteous payback for mutilated soldiers. The mutilations had been grotesque, yes, but they were not the cause of the war. They were the symptom of it. Yet in the fevered American imagination, vengeance replaced truth. By 1877, Crazy Horse surrendered, his people starving, exhausted. Later that year, he was stabbed to death in captivity. Sitting Bull fled north to Canada, clinging to the last scraps of freedom. But hunger eventually drove his people back across the border. The great victory of the summer of 1876 had melted into a long, cold defeat. Custer's last stand was not the end of native resistance, but it was the beginning of the end. It gave Washington the excuse it needed to unleash a total war of extermination. A campaign not aimed at warriors on the battlefield, but at women, children, and the very means of survival itself. The Seventh Cavalry had been destroyed at Little Bighorn, but in the end, it was the tribes who were made to pay the greater price. And yet, even as the ashes of villages smoldered and the buffalo bones whitened across the plains, the legend of Custer was only growing brighter. Because myths don't die easily. They are cultivated, polished, and sold. And Custer's myth was about to be embalmed for generations, thanks to the tireless work of the woman who loved him most. The battlefield was quiet, the tribes scattered, the war machine grinding on. But the story of Custer did not die in the dust of the Little Bighorn. It was resurrected, polished, repainted, weaponized, and at the heart of that resurrection was one woman, Elizabeth Libbie Custer. Libbie understood something most widows never had to. Her husband's death wasn't just a private tragedy. It was a public scandal. George Armstrong Custer had not died a hero in reality. He had died because of arrogance, ambition, and fatal mistakes. If that truth became the accepted version, then his name would be remembered as a cautionary tale, not a legend. And Libbie could not allow that. So she launched a campaign, not with guns or soldiers, but with words, memoirs, lectures, interviews. She toured cities, spoke to crowds, and painted a portrait of her husband as noble, brave, devoted. In her telling, he hadn't been reckless. He had been dutiful. He hadn't been chasing headlines. He had been defending civilization. She transformed chaos into choreography, failure into sacrifice. The boy general became an American saint. And America, hungry for heroes, believed her. School books began to echo Libbie's version. Paintings and illustrations depicted Custer standing tall amid his men, outnumbered but undaunted, the tragic martyr of the frontier. Even the site of the disaster was renamed Custer Battlefield. turning defeat into sacred ground. Truth was buried under layers of patriotic varnish. Meanwhile, the voices of native survivors were silenced or ignored. Sitting Bull's visions, crazy horses' tactics, the grief of women who had watched their homes burn. Those stories rarely made it into the history books. Instead, the victors wrote a story where the vanquished were villains, and the man who had led his soldiers into a trap was canonized as a national hero. The hypocrisy was staggering. The same government that broke treaties, invaded sacred lands, and starved entire nations now stood behind a myth of noble sacrifice. It was like a conman who robs you blind, then accuses you of theft when you fight back. And generations of Americans would grow up repeating the story without ever knowing it was a fabrication. But Libbie's campaign was more than self-preservation. It was also cultural anesthesia. By sanctifying Custer, the nation avoided confronting its own crimes. His death became a distraction from the reality of conquest. People could mourn the fallen hero instead of reckoning with the extermination of native life happening all around them. It was easier to believe in a martyr than to admit to genocide. And so the legend endured. Monuments went up. Poems were written. Hollywood turned the myth into spectacle, charging horses, bugles blaring, Custer's hair catching the light like a halo. The grotesque truth, the mutilated bodies, the panic, the arrogance, was airbrushed out. What remained was a story America wanted to believe, that even in defeat, its soldiers were noble, its leaders brave, its destiny unquestionable. But myths are not harmless. They shape memory, they shape policy, they shape identity. And the myth of Custer's last stand helped justify decades of continued oppression. If Custer was a martyr, then the native victory was a crime. And if it was a crime, then the brutal revenge campaign wasn't cruelty, it was justice. History itself was bent into propaganda. The reality, though, was far uglier. Custer didn't die a hero. He died chasing glory, gambling with men's lives, blinded by arrogance. His last stand wasn't bravery. It was blunder. But thanks to myth-making, millions would never know the difference. And so the legend of the last stand lives on. A story less about what truly happened, and more about what a nation needed to believe about itself. But beneath that legend lies the real horror. The true last stand wasn't Custer's at all. It was the last stand of native freedom on the northern plains.